7 minutes late, we'll skip introductions. But I do want to introduce our team who worked on this framework. And then I particularly want to thank the folks from the CCRD, our contract with IRG Agility, ICF, Stratus, Cascadia, Columbia University, Mountain Institute, Texas, am I skipping things? Environmental Law Institute, for helping us get here. Thank you, everyone. This presentation is mostly going to be from our team and then from Joanne Potter from ICF. So I will stop and turn it over to Bill. Can I stop using this microphone?
You want to do introductions?
I don't.
Okay.
Oh, well,
We can do it as we come
why don't you do it as you come up and we'll introduce you at the end. Bill Breed is our division director. And he's going to step in for Kit.
Bill Breed, as John said, I've been at AID for 9 years working on climate change, worked a number of different parts of climate change issues, DOE for about 15 years before that. I'm really glad to have finally come to one of these meetings, get out of the office, and see folks and maybe have to support that. We're very glad to be able to release now this new climate resilient development framework. It's an update of our adaptation guidance manual that we put out in 2007 that was then picked up by scientific institutions, the Africa Development Bank, some universities, both for its practical approach. It was used in training. It's been nicely recognized. And so we spent the past few years using that approach in trainings and workshops, testing it in the field, refining it. This new framework, we got away from the guidance word, but it's a nice framework, it's a way to think, is consistent with the President's Global Climate Change Initiative, carries forward on what is in the agency's climate change and development strategy, and trying to make, so it's not just for specialists, it's for being able to look at adaptation in various sectors, various other areas that may not be quite so familiar with climate change. Recently, Secretary Kerry sent out a cable to all of his ambassadors, all of his units, really emphasizing his personal interest in climate change and encouraging them to consider climate change in all of their diplomacy and development work. Mentioned a number of resources, and this is part of carrying forward with really internalizing climate change into other areas that may need to be more resilient. Wanted to point out a couple of the Working Group 2 findings, and so I'm going to read them so I get the wording quite right. But the impacts report was just released. Over the next few decades, climate change we experience will be primarily a combination of past actions and current trends. The near term is just an area where short-term risk reduction comes from adapting to changes already underway. The first step towards adaptation to future climate change is by reducing vulnerabilities to current variability. A lot of development stresses out there are making things worse, not more resilient. Poor planning, overemphasizing short-term outcomes, or failing to sufficiently anticipate climate consequences can result in maladaptation, putting more people at risk or exposure. And last, decision support is most effective when it's sensitive to the context and diversity of decision types, processes, and constituencies. And you'll see all of those ideas are internalized, have been what we've been expressing for a while. So the framework's new, but we've been using this in the field, refining it. We're glad to have this out now, and I'd really like the team now to talk more about the detail of what and how. Thanks.
Got me again. Let me say again, thanks for coming. This is a great audience, and we're very relieved to finally be doing this. And sorry for the teaser 6 weeks ago. So what we thought we would do is run through a little bit about what's in this, and then some cases of where we tested it in the development of this. So as Bill said, in 2007 we released a guidance manual that was really aimed at helping aid program managers who already had programs underway look at what they could do to analyze their programs and their vulnerabilities to climate stresses. And we came out with that in 2007, which was before 2010, which was when the funding for the initiative really kicked in. And so with the President's Climate Change Initiative, we knew that our missions would have substantial funding available for new programs, and they wouldn't have to just weave it into something that was going on already. That's not to say that we didn't want them to look at development priorities, but we knew that there would be an ability, if not a desire, to look at things kind of with a blank slate. Early on, we kind of felt like we needed to, it's climate change, we got to think about long-term change. And so we talked a lot about, do we need to do downscaling? Do we need to really think about climate change? Then as we worked through it, we realized that there's not a lot of decisions that are taking place that have a life that lives out to the end of the century where the models are looking. So what we've tried to do with this is walk the users through a process that enables them to look at the things that are most important in their economy or their community or the most important livelihoods, what drives development, and then focus on the information that you need to support the decisions that are most relevant to achieving the outcomes, the development outcomes that you want. So I think where we really add value and where we maybe differentiate from some of the other processes that are out there is the scoping phase. So we don't start with climate information. We start with what drives the economy, what's important for livelihood. And we really recommend working with stakeholders, be it at the national level or the community level, and we're going to talk about a combination of different levels that we've worked out. If you start by talking about what drives the economy or livelihoods, then your audience, when you work with stakeholders, get to stay in their comfort zone, get to talk about the things that they know best. And we found early on that when we started talking about climate change, it was intimidating to a lot of people. We felt like they didn't have the background knowledge, and this was stuff that goes back to the first U.S. national assessment, where we spent time raising everyone's awareness of climate change so they could participate in the conversation. So as you can see, we've got scope, then we've got assess. This gets at the nature of the vulnerability. It may not be vulnerability to a specific stress. It may be a weather service or a climate service that doesn't function well. It may be that it doesn't have computers, so it can't even provide the information that you would need to begin doing a vulnerability assessment. Then we move into the project design, implement, and evaluate and adjust. These are pretty consistent with the typical development program cycle. So we don't emphasize these too much in the guide because program designers are already familiar with that. We wanted to keep the guide as short as we could. I think we got it to about 30 or 40 pages, and really only focus on things that are new. So again, to sum it up very quickly, and you may ask, why did it take 40 pages if this is really good? We want to talk with participants about what's really important in your community or your economy. What are your development objectives? If something we're performing well, what would success look like? Then what does it take to achieve that? What are the inputs in sort of classical economics? What are the land, labor, and capital that you need to do something? What are the inputs? What are the enabling conditions? Do you have the right laws? Do you have the right policies in place? Once we lay that out, then we can begin talking about risks, stresses, shocks, impediments that undermine those key inputs. Is a law not enforced? Does your cropland either dry out or flood regularly and predictably or unpredictably? Are you unprepared for it, and does it undermine that livelihood? And then we can begin talking about solutions. And when we do this, so we plan from the top down, but then we implement and build resilience from the bottom up. And this sort of starts to look like a results framework. So you can work from what do you want to achieve down to what does it take to achieve it. And you can start to see, okay, if I don't have a climate forecast or a seasonal forecast to tell farmers about so they can plan their planting decisions, if I do that and I take care of that impediment, do I get a better result? You can start to see the results. Again, we try to do this very interactively. We don't fill out these boxes. We try to elicit it from participants in the places where we work. The highest level place that we've done it has been Jamaica. It's been really fun working there. A colleague of mine and I, not just because it's Jamaica. Oops. I will say that I think I went down there 7 times and got out of Kingston only once. And Kingston is like, I don't know, excuse me, Kingston, if you're listening, but it's sort of like being in the Bronx, only it's hotter. I mean, you can't see the beach from downtown Kingston, and so not a cautious one. Anyway, I'll stop. So Jamaica produced this National Development Plan, Vision 2030. The high-level outcome is that Jamaica wants to be a developed country by 2030. That's great. But then they laid out these 4 national goals and these national outcomes, and I don't know if you can see them, but healthy and stable population, effective social protection, security and safety, effective governance, stable macroeconomy, competitive industries, ag, manufacturing, mining, construction, sport, tourism, and then down here, sustainable management and use of environmental and natural resources, hazard risk reduction and adaptation to climate change, and sustainable rural and urban development. They're all co-equal. And when I look at this, I think, well, to do these industries, these what I would view as economic sectors, you've got to first have effective governance, a stable macroeconomy, a healthy and stable population. But they're all things that they view as co-equal and separate. And then how do you address, climate change affects all of these, but it's down here as its own little thing. And when you structure things like this, then you tend to assign somebody responsibility for each box. And that's 15 of them. There's not that many ministries and departments in the Jamaican government, so you start to tax people. So what we did in working with the Jamaican government was the Prime Minister asked AID to help them rewrite their climate policy and look across the economy. So we pulled together people from across the government. We asked them to work in mixed teams, taking this document and these outcomes apart, and then putting them back together so they would understand the dependencies. Tourism depends on energy. You produce energy because tourism and agriculture need it, and manufacturing. You don't produce energy if you're not either selling it or using it for something else. And islands don't tend to produce surplus energy for export because it's hard. But they saw energy as a really important economic sector, and it's a very powerful ministry. It's a very capable ministry. So we pulled all these stakeholders together in a workshop. They pulled them together. We helped them. They called the workshop toward the development of a climate policy framework on climate change for Jamaica. And we got people working at tables of about 6 or 8 on the different things that you saw in that previous chart: tourism, agriculture, construction, manufacturing. And we asked them to go through that. What are the inputs? So for agriculture, crops and livestock are an important input. And then we gave them these stickies. Some were pre-populated. They could fill out some on their own. These are the stresses. Black, if you can see it, are the non-climate stresses, and red are the climatic stresses. And they moved it around, and each table did it on their own. And these were mixed tables. So the ag table had people from the Water Authority, from transport, from energy, from ag. They had some NGO people. They had some private sector. This is what it looked like. It's a little bit more readable this way, but inputs for ag are energy, water, crops, livestock, and fisheries, finances and credit, access to credit, and a legal and regulatory framework. You can see the stresses are on the side. And then they started adding things that they could do and who would be responsible for doing that. You could start to see that they built their own interagency working groups. And certain groups come up multiple times. The Energy Ministry in a lot of countries, the Environment Ministry, particularly the Met Service in a lot of developing countries, is not the most powerful ministry. But, and ag and planning often are. But when you see them, this is the Ministry of Water, Land, Environment, and Climate. I call it WALEC, they call it something else. When they come up tied to something as important as agriculture, and they're a key input to the success of the ag ministry, and the ag minister is a powerful minister, you can start paying attention. So one of the things we've been trying to do with this is get the powerful ministries to recognize that the weather and climate services are indispensable to the responsibilities of the powerful ministries. So one final thing on this. Jamaica is producing their national climate policy. It's currently at the stage of being a green paper, which means it's been presented to and accepted by Parliament. It captures this approach. They've called for a point person in each line ministry that is the climate focal point. So in transport, in energy, in tourism, in ag, there's a climate change focal point. They're putting those people into the budgets. And they are, the national climate policy calls on each sectoral policy to be rewritten with a focus on both mitigating emissions and reducing vulnerability to climate impacts. So it's still early in the process, but it's now embedded in how Jamaica is approaching not just climate change, but everything that's important to the economy. And by getting it into those line ministry policies, it's owned by the powerful ministers, not just the one environment minister. So it's central to what they do, not somebody else's problem. I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan Cook, who has done a lot of the work, as has Jenny and Franklin Reed, on getting this guidance document from being a mess of notes written by about 40 different people into a single voice. And Jonathan also led some of our work in West Africa.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Okay, so as John said, one of the things that we think is important or useful about the approach that's in this framework is the fact that it can be used at different scales. So it's flexible and it's meant to help stakeholders at different levels and at different stages think through adaptation and put it in this context of development. And so one of the ways that we've also been trying to put that into practice is actually at the regional level. John talked about a national example, but we actually have been working quite a lot with our mission in West Africa, which is a regional mission. It actually works in a number of countries in West Africa. And they work quite a lot with ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States. That's a regional body that brings together the countries in the region. And together, we convened a process that started again with a kind of workshop that happened last June, to bring the coastal countries in West Africa together to start a process that some of you might know about. It's the National Adaptation Planning Process, which is set up by the UNFCCC, the Climate Convention, to basically get countries to move into more of a long-term process of thinking about adaptation. A lot of countries have already done their NAPAs to kind of think of shorter-term priorities, but the NAP process really is meant to get countries to think longer-term and to think more sectorally, to think about really how to bring adaptation into different sectors and mainstream it. It's a word we hear all the time that's kind of overused, but really it's about bringing climate change into development. And a lot of these countries in West Africa are at a very early stage of thinking about this NAP process. Guidelines had been developed through the UN, but when we looked at those guidelines, we found that while they're actually quite good in a lot of ways, they kind of commit this same, I wouldn't call it an error, but it's an approach that, as John said, really starts with climate. It starts with, how are we as a country vulnerable to climate change? And we don't think that that's necessarily the most productive way to focus, to target, and to kind of actually get things accomplished. And so what we tried to do is take the approach, the framework that John has mentioned, and introduce it to these countries in the context of thinking about their coastal sector. The coastal zone is a really important economic contributor in all of these countries in terms of things like fisheries, the location of big cities, ports, and infrastructure. And so it was kind of a natural place to look at how different sectors interface and interact, and how we can kind of introduce adaptation in the context of development. So in last June in Ghana, in Accra, we had representatives from all of these countries that are part of ECOWAS that have coastal areas, they came together for a few days to talk really about, again, development priorities in the coastal zone, and then climate threats and also non-climate threats, some of the existing issues that they were also dealing with in terms of coastal erosion, pollution, deforestation of coastal forests, and to try to, again, start to see a way to map out priorities and focus that adaptation planning process. And that approach, you can see that's another example of how visually we tried to get these groups of countries to talk about the ways in which their development priorities or sectors were interacting. We also brought into the mix a group of regional institutions. So ECOWAS was there as well, but of course there are a lot of other regional actors that play a part in providing climate services, climate information to the countries. And so it was really important to bring them in at this stage to sort of show that as this process unfolds, they have the countries have other resources in the region that can help them. And so one of the outputs of that process really is a nappable process, we kind of call it, as something that they can take back and introduce to their own ministries and other agencies and try to stimulate a process like this as they start their naps. We have a couple of countries like the Gambia that have already indicated that they're using this, we hope, and we're going to be hopefully working with them and ECOWAS to kind of keep that process going and coordinated across the region as we go forward. So that's kind of up at the regional level, sort of big picture, and John's already talked about a single country where we also were working. I want to talk also briefly about a way in which we think that the framework and the approach is useful at a more local level. And this is, again, some work that we're doing with one of our partners, the Mountain Institute, which does a lot of work in two countries, Nepal and Peru. And they've worked for many years to help local communities think about development, livelihoods, et cetera, and we've been working with them to introduce climate change. But again, one of the goals here was to think development first rather than climate first. So Nepal is a very interesting country in the sense that they've done a lot of the initial thinking on how you get adaptation planning down at the community level. How do you get communities empowered to actually think through their priorities and feed those up to the national level? So Nepal has a very good national planning process, but they've also created these guidelines for something they call a LAPA, a Local Adaptation Plan of Action, which is something that theoretically most of the districts in Nepal will be kind of putting together over the coming years. And again, a little bit like the example I gave with the NAPs, there are guidelines that were developed for these LAPAs with the help of some of the donors. But they start very much from a climate-first perspective. They start with, where do you see climate change affecting you, and why are you vulnerable, and what should you do about it? And we thought that, again, it might be a more productive and efficient way to get communities to think first about what actually matters to them from the perspective of development. So these are areas that we were working at up in the mountains in eastern Nepal, and the Khumbu, which is kind of the Everest region. And so tourism is a huge contributor to the local economy. And so when we went and did consultations with the communities, the things they're really concerned about in many cases are assets that help them to bring in tourists and to get tourists to move around and to house tourists. So you have things like bridges, lodges, paths, and a lot of those actually are very vulnerable to things like flooding, extreme rain events, glacial lake outburst floods, which are a big threat in Nepal. This idea of lakes building up behind glacial moraine and bursting. And so by starting with those development priorities as assets that really matter for these communities, we were able to focus the discussion on vulnerability and on climate change and to start thinking about how to prioritize adaptation actions. And so the goal of that LAPA process, and this has been a year-long process with a lot of consultations, working with communities to map their hazards and their assets, but it's to feed that back up to the national government and to inform the NAPA and the NAP, because Nepal is also going to be doing a NAP. It's something that's a little more locally grounded and locally real. And that's really important because the way that the adaptation funding works in Nepal the central government gives out resources to districts and communities to implement projects. And so we hope that this is a way to influence that process to make sure that those funds, which are not huge, are going to go to the most important priorities and sectors for communities. So that model has worked quite well, and actually the Mountain Institute have taken it to their work in Peru, which is in the Huaraz region, that's another mountainous region up in the Andes with some of the same issues, and they've actually introduced it, and this is kind of a new thing in Peru. Peru didn't have a LAPA process, but by importing this and kind of piloting it, they've actually been able to, again, get the communities engaged and the national government really interested in how to use this to inform their planning and their distribution of resources. So again, we think that this framework, it's been able to scale up and down and kind of, help stakeholders at different levels. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Joanne Potter from ICF, who's going to talk a little bit about another example.
Hi. So I'd like to tell you about the CRIS program, the Climate Resilient Infrastructure Services program that we're leading under the CCRD program. And this has been a project that is really focused on the needs of rapidly growing cities. And we're working with 4, if you count Hue, Vietnam, that Cascadia is working with 5 cities in different parts of the world to look at their development objectives and help them work with climate information as an integral part of their planning and development process, so that as they grow, they're making investments and decisions throughout their process wisely. We chose pilot cities to work with that are all in coastal regions, that are second-tier cities, that are growing rapidly, and are already maxed out, frankly, in terms of the stresses that they're facing as they try to manage their growth and development. And then adding climate stressors into that is one more complication for cities that are really working hard to manage their growth in a responsible way. The focus is on infrastructure, and not because infrastructure in itself is such a cool thing, but infrastructure is often the linchpin for developing cities as they figure out how to grow. So they're building roads, they're building water and sewer systems, they're trying to manage expanding populations and make sure that their residents are safe and well served by municipal services. And in that process, they're building a lot of stuff. And so the question is, how can they make those investments in all that infrastructure in ways that won't be maladaptive, that will serve the needs of their population over many decades? And so that's the challenge. And we are working with each of these cities to apply the CRD framework as they make those decisions. So to give you an example, with the city of Piura in Peru, they're really feeling a lot of economic development pressures because of an expanding agriculture system in their region, and folks are coming down from the mountains where they can't get jobs, and they're moving to Piura where they can find work. And so they have really rapidly growing informal settlements that are hard to see. We have been working with them, and this kind of falls into the scope and planning stage. Working with them to incorporate climate language into their urban development plan, so that as they make their investments in the projects that they have on their priority list, They know that the contractors who bid on that development will need to incorporate climate as part of the process for that development. Another thing that we've been doing is developing a screening tool that they can use to look at all the projects in their pipeline and try to identify how climate change might put those investments at risk. So they know before the investments are made that they have changes that they might want to make in terms of the location or the siting or the design of that infrastructure. In Trujillo, we're working with the municipality to use the climate information that has already been developed through a grant that they got from IDB, and to apply the climate vulnerability information they have, which is all very interesting, but what's the relevance to the decisions they're making at the municipal level? Well, we're working with them to translate that climate information into threshold information for the investments that they're going to be making. What does that climate information mean for that road that they're building? What does that climate information mean for the frequency of flooding that they may have to accommodate? And so making the translation between climate information to the investments and decisions that cities are making is the focus. In Mozambique, and Charlotte Mack is here, Charlotte and Molly Helmuth, they're working on a pilot in Nacala, Mozambique. The economic driver there is a whole lot of natural resource extraction that's going on now that the civil war has ended and the country is getting back on its feet. Well, that's great. There's a lot of development going on, but they're also building a lot of infrastructure on very unstable soil at very steep slopes, and a lot of that infrastructure is failing. So how do they, even now, under existing weather conditions, so how do they incorporate future climate conditions to have smarter development as they go along? So it's that sort of mainstreaming of climate information that we're trying to do with each of the cities that we're working with. The other city is Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. And there the economic driver is tourism in large part. And similar to the other cities we've been working with, they're dealing with burgeoning populations that are settling in very risky areas. In Santo Domingo, the CRIS team has worked with the municipality to put together a range of stakeholders, including the Met Service, the different national and municipal agencies, offices, and the major local NGO to work together to identify how climate is going to affect their capacity to continue to develop. And by having all those brains at the table at once, each of those players understands a piece of the problem, and they're also a piece of the solution going forward. So Chris has been helping do that, facilitate that collaborative process at the local level. So we're working with those cities, and we think we're adding value to those cities as they're moving forward with their development. But at the end of the day, that's just a few cities. So the most important part in some ways is the peer exchange and the dissemination of the tools and materials that we're developing as we work with each of these cities. And next year, a lot of our focus will be on that lessons learned and dissemination of the tools we're developing. But we started a couple weeks ago in Santo Domingo when we held our Latin America and Caribbean workshop and worked with ISC and other partners to have this workshop where we brought together 8 cities in Latin America and the Caribbean to talk about how their development plans are being affected by climate change and to share the different tools that they're using. One final thought I wanted to leave you with is that last year, actually, we used an early version of the framework that's being released in all its glory today, but put together an infrastructure fact sheet booklet that you may find interesting. And this looks at several different types of infrastructure and looks at how the framework can be applied to making sound decisions about infrastructure development.
Okay, so we heard first about this, Jenny Frankel-Reed. I'm in the climate change office, also on the adaptation team. And we've always sort of dreamed of this day when this would be finished because it took quite a lot of iterations to really get it right to a point where we were happy. So this is an exciting day for everybody. So we heard first at the national level of examples of its application, then at the regional level, then at the local scale in an integrated sense. Rand just told us about sort of a more sectoral or input level. This is an example at a local sectoral level. So in Iloilo, in the Philippines, looking at water and water security issues, applying this kind of approach. And really the value in this case of taking that scoping step up front was that we had a much more tailored study. So this region is kind of a donor darling region. There's been a lot of attention on water issues in this area, and for some reason not a lot of action. There were cases where the main intake for the city water supply was actually dry for 30 days at a time. It was a surface intake. So even with all of that evidence and all of those problems already, clearly there were some barriers to understanding where to act and how to act and where to start. And so with that knowledge, we really zoomed in on getting the right people around the table to pay attention to what the findings of this were, to make the connection between the local issues in Iloilo and some of the national regulatory constraints to solving some of the local water security issues, and also then starting to provide an analysis of options so that we could really figure out why a lot of the seemingly urgent sort of actions on water security had not already been taken up. And so really just kind of boiled down into a report and presentation, which then informed the development of what's now the Be Secure project in the Philippines, funded by USAID Philippines. Some approaches, some useful sort of one-page comparisons of options and that kind of thing. So trying to make this information really actionable. And so the Be Secure project now has activities in Iloilo in 4 other sites as well. The last site that was added was Leyte, which was highly affected by Hurricane Yolanda and is now really an important place where this kind of an approach is going to be used in really a post-disaster situation. So I won't say too much about Iloilo. I think that was kind of the most important part, was where you have a clear problem and a lack of action, how stepping back to identify, well, what's happening locally and what are the barriers to people at a local level really being able to take action was very important. There were certain issues around the ability to set tariffs, the ability to permit, that were preventing the local water utilities from really planning and making local investments in water supply. Before we wrap up, 2 final points. One that I wanted to just step back to the guide itself. So in terms of what's here, it's very simply written. We talk to each other a lot about climate change adaptation, but we have we have the whole development community to really speak to about what this is and what this means. And so you'll see very simple wording around why climate resilient development. We have a short section about what's different about climate resilient development. I bet if you've been working in the adaptation space, that question comes to you a lot. What is different about doing this? So we've made an effort to summarize that in 5 bullets. We also have explained, drawing on the experience of us as well as others, why starting with climate data is confusing, why it's not always an efficient use of resources, as John explained, and why bringing it in later, as we've done in this guide, makes sense. So that's kind of the setup for what then follows in these steps. And as John said, the first two steps have the most attention. Because if you diagnose problems correctly, the solutions we all kind of know how to do through the work we do in development. The other thing that's coming up a lot in USAID now is theories of change and being more explicit about how we understand the problems and what our theories are about how we're going to solve them. And so this framework is very much consistent with that emphasis on USAID. The sort of problem diagnosis that John showed from Jamaica really lends itself to that structure of thinking. So the final slide here is just that this doesn't sort of stand alone. It's short, and there's more, obviously, to doing this work well. So additional documents that are in the works include a vulnerability assessment annex, which gets more into that assessment step. There's a lot to that step, depending on how robust a job you do, and so that will be coming out later this year. Looking at climate change, climate resilient development in water, coastal and marine environments, climate change adaptation or climate resilient development and governance issues across the board, marginal populations and the unique issues for ensuring that those populations are represented, and finally some additional information on evaluating adaptation options. So I think that's it for slides.
So, thank you. Let me just summarize by, again, thanking our team at AID, Jenny, Andre Mershon, who didn't speak. He's capable of it, he just didn't want to today. He's done a lot of our work. You've probably heard that AID is moving into more resilience work. Andre's led our work in the Sahel for AID. Jonathan Cook, Bill, Nora Firm is not here. She's at a training, but she's really worked on the CRIS program. And then Lily, Skylar, Joanne, Wendy, oh my God, I'm so sorry, Charlotte. Where's Michael? I see Deborah, Michael. Who am I forgetting? And then not here is Glenn Anderson, who's the chief of party. Oh, there's Randy and Peter's in here somewhere. Glenn Anderson is in North Carolina, where he always is, or often is. Jason Vogel and Joel Smith out at Status in Colorado. Yoon. Muko, of course. I said Deborah. And I probably, now I said Deborah twice. She deserves 3 or 4 mentions because she holds everything together for us. But thanks to everyone. This was very much a group effort. And thanks to all the folks in AID who reviewed it. It's not reviewed as much as the IPCC, but we do have 10 pages of comments that we addressed. And thanks to our missions, the ones that we were able to work with as we developed it. And anyone from Jamaica is listening or watching, I love Jamaica. I didn't mean to dismiss it. But when you're in Kingston, it does sort of feel like you're Moses. You know there are beautiful beaches out there beyond the city limits. But it's been great working with the government. The Met Service is fantastic. The Ministry of Water, Land, Environment, and Climate has been a great partner. And the mission there has been fantastic. So we can take questions now, or not.
I'm Mark from
Oh, I think we need to get a microphone.
Or I can just really speak really loud.
Let's put people online. It's for, we have a web, it's a webinar, so.
Oh, okay.
Just want to make sure they got
I didn't think it was working, that's why you guys weren't using it.
I think it works for online, but not for this room.
Okay. I'm Sean Martin from WWF. I really love the framework, the development first, climate second. It really takes the onus off of doing something from the climate people to the development people where it should be. And I was just curious, in the process, are there opportunities by focusing on what's important to the community or the nation by sector? That's what they focus on in the process. But are there opportunities to look at alternatives what alternatives they could develop in case what is important now may not be viable much longer in the future? Or is it just focusing on what is important now and trying to maintain that?
Question. When we started thinking about doing it this way, I think Bill and I had a conversation about how do you get people to think across time. And it would be great to have a conversation at some level about 80% of the people in country X are farmers today. In 50 years, there's going to be twice as many of them. The weather or the climate is going to be less amenable. We need the food, but we don't need everybody to be a farmer. How do you make that transition? Hard to find. I haven't come across a country that's ready to have that kind of a conversation. That was what we wanted to do when we started thinking this way. I think it would be great. And hopefully by working through this, countries or communities will start to say, oh, this may not even be working for us now. And if we think about it long term, then there's definitely going to start to be some pinch points, and it may not be that far in the future. We've seen a couple of things. We did a little work in Nepal just recently under the umbrella of resilience. And the government of Nepal and a lot of the donor aid support groups working there treat migration as a bad thing. And it can be. And I think 300 people died who had migrated to work elsewhere last year. And that's bad. But it generates 25% of GDP. It is an adaptation, and it is one that perhaps we should look at as a positive, that we can empower the people who are migrating to do something differently. The ones that come back tend to bring back money and invest in the community. So it may be that there's even a little switch early on where you say, well, wait, maybe we're looking at this the wrong way. Because how can something that's generating 25% of the GDP be all bad? Maybe we can make it better. So I would love to get to the point where we can look across 3 or 4 decades and have that conversation, but it's hard to get there when there are often very pressing issues in a country right now.
And I'd add that we saw very much the same issues around migration in our work in the Sahel with the Joint Planning Cell, and we embraced migration as part of resilience, as part of adaptation to climate change, and wrote it in because it is something that people are going to do, and we want to help them make it safe and profitable.
I don't need to be the only one that talks.
I just wanted to add one thing on that, which is I think it also depends. So I think the framework is flexible enough to open up that conversation if the stakeholders want to go there. It doesn't have, we have it often written in terms of things like assets, but you can also interpret that as not, being wedded to a particular asset, but the service that provides, right? So if you talk more in terms of the goals, longer term, there's different ways to get there. They may not be able to build bridges over rivers that are flooding, more often and more violently, but there may be other ways to get people across the river. So I think it's a little bit in the way that it's adapted and actually used, but we do think that that's a really critical part of the conversation in some places.
John, we have a couple questions from the online participants. So the first one from Elizabeth Shope of the Natural Resources Defense Council. And the question is, what is the interplay between the national adaptation plans and USAID's country development cooperation strategies? Specifically, I'm interested in this because USAID's Water and Development Strategy Implementation Field Guide was released recently, and a lot of the more specific implementation is left to the country development cooperation strategies, whereas the NAPs aren't even mentioned in the Water and Development Strategy Field Guide.
So
I think there's a couple of things to remember or keep in mind with the water strategy. It's really focused on water and sanitation and also on water for agriculture, and that's it. And a lot of that has to do with the intent and direction from Congress on what they want the water funding to be spent on. The CDCS itself is really a strategy for what the agency works on. There is a certain limitation there on what their funding streams are going to be in the future. So they really, it's not a completely holistic thing. It is intended to drive some strategic thought and some engagement with other donors, but it's there's not going to be a one-to-one link between a national adaptation plan and a CDCS. That said, one of the things that we refer to both in our strategy and in our guidance to field missions is to look at what existing assessments, plans, priorities are out there already. We really want to focus on actions and not more vulnerability assessments or plans. And so the first thing is to get people to go look at what resources there are there.
I'll just add one thing on the NAPs, just to add to that, is that it's really new. I mean, a lot of countries are still kind of grappling with what it is, what it means, how to do it. That's why we've sort of gone into this space, because there's an opportunity to really hopefully drive or push the way it's being interpreted and applied by a lot of countries. But a lot of what you hear when you mention NAPs is, oh, it's just like the NAPAs that we did 5 years ago or 10 years ago. It's not really supposed to be. It's supposed to be longer term. It's supposed to be, like I said, much more about mainstreaming, not about a list of priority projects, which is kind of what the NAPAs often were. But that's not totally understood yet. And so I think as countries are learning more and understanding it better, I think the goal is to sync it up with these other things that are underway.
I think the water strategy, Bill was right. The other issue was that the NAPs are fairly new, and the water strategy was a long time coming. I don't think it was quite as long as this adaptation framework, but it took a long time, and I think they have had near final drafts before NAPs.
Alice Thomas from Refugees International. John, thank you for your presentation, and to everybody else. Very comprehensive document, very interesting, and I have to look at it more carefully. But my question is about some of the resiliency policies that have been implemented in the humanitarian sphere, and specifically USAID's Building Resilience in Humanitarian Crises, or Current Crises, I think is the name of that document. Can you talk a little bit more, and maybe this is mentioned in the comments on what's happening in the Philippines, but how this would link into post-disaster scenarios like in the Philippines or in countries that are experiencing recurrent crises like Sahelian countries?
Go ahead, and I'll.
So the resilience policy was developed to look at, it kind of was to answer the question, how can we keep having these humanitarian crises in places where what are our development investments alleviating the crisis aspect of an event? And it got started, it really kind of focused the agency's mind with the drought in the Horn and then the drought in the South. And in the Sahel, Andre was able to get involved and kind of make the case that this is a drought. It's a climatic event that is resulting in a crisis because people were not prepared to deal with it. Because there were 1,000 little vulnerabilities that were health and education and public service related that meant that when the stress of the drought was imposed on all those other problems, it really brought to the fore all the problems that were there. And so there is a cross-agency working group, or there are several cross-agency working groups dealing with the resilience policy, and our office is a part of that. But the resilience policy is looking beyond strictly climatic risks. So it is looking at, in Nepal, we talked a lot about seismic risks, but we also talked a lot about just the underlying poverty. It keeps people from being able, it keeps people on the knife edge. You know, if somebody gets sick, it's very hard for a family or a household to keep its livelihood coming. So the resilience policy is broader than the adaptation work, but adaptation is increasingly a strong part of the resilience agenda.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is to figure out where does adaptation fit within that resilience agenda, and it's something that we struggle with a lot in our work in the Sahel. What is the role of climate change? We know that drought is a climate stress. It's affecting the resilience of folks there, but there are a lot of other stresses which are also playing on that. I think that's where the framework like this is very interesting because, again, we're looking at climate in context of a whole lot of other development stresses. When it comes to the question, that's kind of more the long-term stress, but when it comes to the issues around kind of post-disaster reconstruction, I think that's an area where we're still exploring. I think that's one where we could use some input from our partners. Most of us come from the development side of the house and not the humanitarian side of the house. And one of the things that I learned working on this joint planning cell with the development people and the humanitarian people is there are a lot of other interests, a lot of other people who come with different mandates, different types of money, different things they want to achieve, and different time frames in which to achieve it. And so I think we're still struggling a little bit how to rectify all those goals. One other big challenge for us is we put a lot of money out there through our food assistance programs, both emergency and non-emergency. And I think one of the other big challenges for the agency, how do we think about adaptation and some of the programming that we're doing there? We have billions of dollars a year in Food for Peace programming, and so I think that's another challenge for us to work with our colleagues and also our Food for Peace partners. In many cases, they're doing things that could help the adaptive capacity of the communities where they're working in. I was just in Ethiopia. They're building tons of retaining walls and planting trees and things like that. But how do we make sure it's really done in a climate resilient manner? I think that's a big challenge for us going forward.
I was just going to say that this is not a required tool. So in the case of Postdisaster Philippines, we hope they'll look and read some of this, but that's not a requirement for the agency.
Hi, Tom Buck from SSG Advisors. I just have a question. I think the framework is definitely very useful, and I was wondering if USAID project was planning on issuing or working on an accompanying toolkit that would be more practical in terms of translating the theory a little bit into action, help at the local level, help at the regional level, the national level, integrated level.
I don't know. We've all the whole team has been saying that we want to get out of the guidance business. I don't know. I think we'll kind of see how it's received. It says in the preface on like kind of page 4 or whatever that we would like feedback from the community, both on edits we should make to it. We'd like to collect cases. If anybody beyond us tries it, let us know how it works. Submit a case study. We could consider some kind of a toolkit or implementation, something or other, but we're trying to keep this fairly short and pragmatic and not too theoretical. Possibly when we get beyond that list of 5 other things that we've got in the works, we could think about this, but it's hard to start thinking about another thing like this when we just finally got this thing.
I think when we were writing this, the vulnerability assessment section became longer and longer and longer because that's where you need tools and templates and matrices and things, and so we pulled it out. So I think at least on the vulnerability assessment piece, we might be able to provide some of that kind of toolkit friendly or templates or tools that we find useful in that piece and keep this one short and sweet.
Hi, Laura Arnson, independent consultant, although kind of recently with Food for Peace and USA Liberia and now heading to DTS. My question it was similar to the online question about how does this work with the CDCS, the Country Development Cooperation Strategies. because I can't help but think that if you do insist that an assessment is one of those required assessments, and you make sure it's integrated, then when the CDCS and a mission is working with, say, a Ministry of Finance and Planning and other big players, it will actually coordinate, and you'll find that those with the holding on to the funding, the finances, then might be a little more committed, or you'll have that cooperation and collaboration that things might get done. So I'd kind of like to see that really tie in much more closely, because otherwise you might have two different messages or coming into two different places within the host governments, and might be more effective to make sure you're reaching those with the decision-making power.
We would like to see that. It really, in a lot of cases, it depends on timing. So in Jamaica, serendipity got us in there doing the climate work as they were beginning work on the CDCS. And so not only did the mission director who's been fantastic, but she kind of said, look, let's slow down our CDCS process. We're going to have people from practically every ministry in the Jamaican government in the room talking about their national development plan. Let's take advantage of that and then weave the findings back into the CDCS. She asked the other donors to suspend their new investments until Jamaica finished this process. Other places were out of sync, and there's incredible pressure for them to get their CDCSs done on a timeline.
I didn't raise guidance though on how to integrate it into this.
So the CDCS, just for anybody who doesn't know, is the Country Development Cooperation Strategy, which is the 5-year USAID mission strategy for where they would like to partner with the country. In the new ADS, so the rules for how the agency operates, it is required to consider climate change in the CDCS. So that's there. The degree, the comprehensiveness of that step is the thing that is based on each country's context, each country's investment areas. It may be more or less relevant to different countries. What we are doing, though, is providing a lot of guidance to that process to accompany that ADS requirement, so that missions have some help, some questions that they should be considering. We do have a review process for every CDCS that includes the E3 office and the climate change office to weigh in on the degree to which climate has been considered sufficiently. So that's a new step, but I think one we're making some good progress on. We also did a review of the CDCSs that had been submitted for their the quality of the job that they had done to do that, and it's not bad. There's room for improvement, but that's happening.
I wanted to go back to the previous question about the toolkit. You'll notice that it's spiraled down in 3-hole punched, and so the idea was that it could go into a binder, because we built I think the guy who asked it may have left, but the idea was that we also developed training materials that are more like PowerPoint versions of the information in here and on our mitigation side of the program. The idea was that it could go into a binder and become sort of an individual library with the activities from training activities woven in throughout it. That's why it's 3-hole punch. But we didn't have anything else to put with it yet, so we put the spiral binding as well. Any other questions in the room?
First of all, congratulations on getting the report out. And it's a lot harder to write something simply than it is to write it in a complex way, and it takes real mastery of the subject matter. And that's a real benefit to the community that you're serving. So thank you for that. One of the 5 bullets that you mentioned distinguishes climate resilient development from other development activities. It looks forward and plans for the future. And what we know from the past research and from the 5th IPCC report is that probably the most acute immediate climate change impacts are going to be from sea change and redistribution of precipitation patterns. So you have real regional scale resource scarcity issues in both those areas. I mean, you've had a couple of questions already today about the humanitarian impact, of, for example, the drought in the Sahara. You also see in your annex in the back where you talk about sample impacts, again and again, conflict, food security, water security, migration. So I know that the climate adaptation works with the UNFCCC, and that you're writing an annex on conflict. But do you see a role for yourself, looking forward and planning for the future and developing sort of regional scale institutions to deal with the negotiating reasonable resource sharing as resource configurations change, managing population movements, migrations, negotiations, systematic negotiation to head off large-scale conflict, or is that an IO responsibility, and yours and USAID's role there is more of a supporting advisory role?
It wouldn't be our office. If anything like that were to come up, I think it would either come out of State Department or Regional Bureau of Aid, or more likely a collaboration between DACA missions, either a national or a bilateral or a regional mission, and state.
But don't you have a kind of like a thought leadership role in there somewhere?
Yeah, and we support them throughout. So we're engaged now in the resilience agenda, and we support the State Department in negotiations. But we wouldn't go out and like that on our own. But yeah, I hope that they include us. And it's been great to have Andre included in the JPC for the Sahel.
And there's a lot of attention to climate change impacts exacerbating some of the drivers of conflict. And as you've seen in the most recent QBR from DOD and in the one before that, they recognize that climate change can be a threat multiplier, but it really adds to other things. And what I think that there's a whole community of people that look at drivers of conflict, and the trick I think with climate change is really putting a finger on where and what. And so we have to get to helping really get people to think about what the changes are, reducing the risks, the vulnerabilities, keeping in mind that that's one of the potential endpoints is getting to conflict. It's part of the benefit of us working with our regional missions and with the growing interest in DOD and in the conflict mitigation community. But there's, I think, a lot of work to be done about what exactly would you do now? I think somewhat just thinking about the fact that this could be a problem, could be fomenting more instability, should drive action now. This is what we're trying to do.
Just one addition, our office is funding in Ethiopia conflict resolution centers as a pilot adaptation project to look at pastoral and agricultural communities and the conflicts that are emerging there. So we do have one project that's sort of piloting that concept, and it's maybe 1 year in, but hopefully we can share some of the results from that.
And we do have an annex that was not on the list that Peter Schultz and others have been working on with the Institute for Security Studies in East Africa. It's a South Africa-based organization with an office in Addis, and aids DACA Bureau's Conflict Management and Mitigation Office. So that's been a joint effort and the Wilson Center, between the four organizations, looking at the relationships between climate change, adaptation, and peace building. Peter and Newpol gave a talk about the work we did with them 3 or 4 months ago. Any other questions here in the room? There may be some more online.
Reese Warren with Development Training Services. You just said that you're looking forward to getting out of the guidance business, so I hate to ask, but the annexes that you listed, what are you thinking about when those might be done and what the process for doing them will be?
For a number of them, we are now, this team is the holdup. We've gotten, particularly Jason Vogel, who's not, out in Boulder, has done an incredible job of tidying them all up, giving them a common voice, getting them to us to review. So I think water, coastal governance, and marginal populations are in, and vulnerability is on the home stretch, maybe close. So what is that? 4 or 5 of them, and then Peter, what's up with conflict? And that one, that's a more complicated one because we've got those 4 groups all chiming in on it. And we promised the stakeholders at the second workshop in Addis that they could have a voice as well. So they're all, we're hoping, we said it vaguely sometime in 2014 because nothing has been on the timeline that we dreamed of. But we thought this thing would be done 2 or 3 years ago. But we're hoping soon.
Can I just add one more on the conflict question? One more example. It's not quite at maybe the type of conflict I think you were asking about, but another approach that we've been using, not our office, but USAID more broadly, is to support regional institutions. So, one example in Southern Africa, our mission, which is a regional mission, has worked a lot with the river basin organizations there because water conflict is obviously a big concern. Also in West Africa. But so it's building up the technical sort of capacity and the abilities of those very, locally based organizations to play at least some sort of a mediating role in getting better information through the process. So that's another.
Great. Anything else?
So we have a question from Kathleen from Oxfam. Her question is, can you tell us a bit more about how you anticipate the new framework will be applied by missions or other sectors within USAID? We know that integration was one of the priorities of the climate and development strategy. Is there any mandate from USAID leadership that this framework be applied in other bureaus or offices?
No, there is no mandate. There is a recommendation.
That's very good.
There is support for it, but it is not required that they follow it. It is the foundation of the training that our office gives to, I think we've given it to over 400 aid staff.
About 500 people in the last 3 years who have been trained using information and guidance that builds off the framework that was presented today.
And what was presented today has been refined through the process of trying it either in the field or in the training and then coming back to it. So it's not mandated, but it's out there. When we are able to go and give support to a mission, obviously there's a closer tie, but we hope they're using it. And we've had talks with some other organizations that like it, and so we're hoping it'll get out beyond just aid as well.
Rose Schneider, Health Systems Management.
You can be here right now.
Oh yeah, you got the shower.
In looking at the Jamaica effort, did you have any feedback from the more powerful ministries that they didn't want to use their money for this and they wanted money from the environment ministry? I've been involved in multi-sectoral nutrition planning, and it was often, well, yeah, we like the idea, but then give us the money or funnel the money through us.
It's still very early. We haven't, the only thing we've done beyond working with them on developing the policy is it was decided that through everything we worked on, weakness at the Met Service was an impediment to what they wanted to do. So we convened a smaller group with the Met and Climate Service and their clients from across the government, the Water Authority, Public Works, Ag Extension, Ag Research, et cetera. We asked who would benefit from better weather and climate information at some time scale. You define the time scale. hands down, everyone agreed that drought information for farmers developed jointly between Ag Extension and the Met Service would be highly valuable. Our hope was that Ag Extension would say, wow, this is really helpful. We can't support the farmers the way we should without this information, so we will go to bat for the Met Service at budget time.
Not give budget to them.
Not give it. I mean, we're hoping that it'll get built into the sort of parental budgeting process, that they'll treat the Met Service as a key item to be budgeted for. We'll see what happens. The first drought, it's a drought bulletin. It came out in January. So we'll see what happens in the budget cycle. We hope that Ag Extension will support, will offer support for the Met Service, but we'll see.
Have you ever had any of the Mets act as a consulting operation and actually consult and get funds to consult?
Is that what's going on in Mali? Is that the model that you said they were making it kind of a quasi-governmental Met Service in Mali? Is that is it envisioned that it will become a consulting service?
It's envisioned that it will raise a lot of its revenue from selling services.
And this gets sticky with WMO and US policy that says that weather and climate data is a public good and it shouldn't be sold a second time. It's developed with public finances.
Okay.
It should be free. I got lectured by the head of the water authority in Jamaica. When he finished lecturing the Met Service, he then lectured me about these guys. Why are you supporting them if it's NOAA policy that data should be free? So it's a sticky issue, but then it does take resources for Met Service to deliver services. So we're what we proposed to Jamaica was, if you're stuck down here with no resources and you're not providing useful services, we'll provide the services so you can we'll provide the resources so you can take the first step towards better service, and hopefully that will make the case that you should be budgeted.
Okay. Thank you.
So one more question from online. This is from Susil from Cambridge Systematics. What are some of the questions that you are fielding on the economics of climate change adaptation and the cost to some of these developing countries which have severe resource constraints just to keep up?
I was just thinking, I'm so glad you're the lead here.
Well, so what questions are we hearing
About
the cost of adaptation?
Right, essentially the cost. She says the economics of climate change adaptation and the cost to these countries.
I act like a politician. I'm going to answer the question that I wish had been asked instead. One of the things that so I bet it's kind of skirted. One of the things that we see is that particularly in one of the Nepal LAPAs, they did a sensitization exercise with the community. And then the community came back and said that now that they knew more about climate change, they realized that pretty much everything was caused by climate change. And the examples were earthquakes, landslides, and slash and burn agriculture are all driven by climate change. And I thought, wow, that's new. So, to not answer the question, one of the things that we are trying to watch out for is that everything doesn't get lumped in as a climate problem and therefore something that needs to be funded with climate funds. One of the reasons we do that, we structured the framework the way we did was so that you could see what are the non-climate impediments to the objectives that you're pursuing. If there's a governance problem, if zoning laws are not enforced, if you have never been well adapted to a tropical storm, it doesn't really matter if you start to see more category 2s or categories 4s, you're still going to suffer, and there may be underlying problems that haven't been addressed. So I think it's a pretty thorough non-answer to that question. You want to say
But to
something?
go a little bit further on it, if you look at the IPCC impacts report that just came out,
one of the points that they make is that climate change impacts are couched within the other development stresses and damages. And so, you know, climate change is not the cause of all problems. And there's a lot of reasons to address those other impediments or bad development practices, because climate change will only make them worse. And I think some of the recent stuff about Bangladesh is really illuminating. You know, everybody's arguing about sea level rise. Well, sea level rise, you know, a few inches, maybe at the very extreme, a meter in the next 90 years. I said the extremes. Dhaka, right now, because of taking water out of the ground and not getting silt flowing down the rivers, is sinking by as much as 9 inches a year. So sea level rise that's, you know, a couple of millimeters a year has no relation to what's being done by the recovery of fresh water out of fossil sources. And I think if you look at some of the work that NASA's GRACE satellite has shown in the past couple of years, the problems with freshwater withdrawals are much, much greater and immediate than what's going to just get worse.
So back just quickly on economics. I think one of the things that we're hearing from a lot of our missions are questions about financing adaptation. So sort of jumping not so much first to, well, what's it going to cost, but really we know what we need, how does that get financed? And I think there's still, even though we've been talking about it for quite a while in this field, a need to better understand the financial flows into key adaptation relevant sectors and make sure that we are engaging the private sector where that's where those costs are born, engaging the public sector and public budgets like in Jamaica towards certain kinds of investments, and then using those international funds as really catalytic types of projects to demonstrate, to remove barriers, to do some of these things that are not as, not as costly really in the long term, because the scale of funds is at a bit of a mismatch where the international funds will never be able to pay for all of that. So I think there is a renewed and growing interest related to economics on financing adaptation and better accessing appropriate financial flows toward those costs. If I could say one more thing back to the toolkit question and the guidance question, I think that this is also a request to all of you, to all of our contractors, to all of our partners, to respond to the priorities, to the approaches, to the principles that are in here, to develop some more, some tools that we've never thought of to bring this to life, so that we don't continue to see more of sort of the processes that we think are less cost effective, that we think are less impactful, that start with climate change scenarios first. So I would kind of put that toolkit question back to our partners and our implementers to say, help us bring this to life, help us come up with some more really effective and innovative